our next speaker will be Pilar Fernandez.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really excited to present this project because of the emphasis. There was an interdisciplinary research earlier today. This is truly an interdisciplinary work. I'm going to present on just a component of it, but it includes researchers from the behavioral sciences, economics, ecology, epidemiology, just to try to understand what are the drivers of tick-borne disease risk in humans. I hope that I can convince you that tick-borne diseases, it is a big public health issue here in the US. The majority of all vector-borne diseases being reported are tick-borne diseases, and particularly Lyme disease, which is a big public health issue in the Northeast and the Midwest mainly. So even though I'm going to be talking about tick-borne diseases in general, most of the conclusions are going to be on Lyme disease. So one of the questions we have, as Gonzalo Vázquez-Procopec mentioned earlier today, is the poor correlation between vector density and human risk. So one of the questions we always have is, does more tick translate to more cases? And is there a threshold that determines human risk? And one of the particular things about tick-borne diseases is that humans are incidental hosts. And most of what I'm going to call the hazard, which is basically what has the potential to cause harm in humans, to distinguish that from human risk, it's going to be the density of infected nymphs, which is immature stage that correlates with human cases mostly. And the density of infected nymphs, it's going to be driven mostly by the characteristics of the enzootic transmission cycle. So it's going to depend on the wildlife host dimension, which depends on the host availability, and it's going to depend on abiotic factors. And humans get the translation between the hazard into risk. It depends on how humans interact with the risky environments. And this is work that has been funded by NSF, the Kaplan Natural and Human System grant. I think it has a different name now. But it's about integrating the human behavioral component and the ecology of tick-borne diseases. And what we're trying to understand is what are the processes and how the different processes interact, and if there are feedbacks in the system that cannot let us understand if there are emerging properties that allow us to understand the Lyme disease risk at the community level. So this is basically our general hypothesis, and we're thinking that, as I mentioned, the tick hazard is mostly driven by the enzootic transmission cycle that depends on the host dynamics. But humans get exposed depending on the behavioral decisions. So the activity patterns and the personal protection measures that they take, and they can feed back into the system by introducing different interventions at different scales. The main issue we have is, and it's a key parameter, and everybody doing infectious disease modeling know that the vector-human contact rate, it is one of the key parameters that we want to estimate, but it's also really hard to estimate. So we can use mathematical models to do that. And as again, one of the approaches that we're taking is to understand can we understand human tick contact rates based as an emerging property of the system, based on how human moves in the environment and the tick density. And if we can do that, then we can estimate the behavior of the Lyme disease prevalence over time, or incidence. So these models are inherently counterfactual, and we can use them to explore different scenarios and kind of get ahead of if we introduce an intervention, what are we going to see, and what are the counterintuitive effects that we're going to see. So as I mentioned, these are the two main things that we need to take into account to estimate the human contact rate: the activity patterns, mobility patterns, and the use of personal protection measures, together with the density of infected nymphs. I don't need to give you a lecture on the different type of models that we can have to try to approach this, but here we decided to use an agent-based model, or individual-based model, where we can think people going through different stages, so from susceptible to exposed to infected and recover. And each person can have different behaviors, and they can also adapt their behaviors based on their exposure. So that gives us a lot of flexibility to have the heterogeneity in the human movement, and also introduce some stochasticity into the system and understand this human tick contact rate as an emerging property at the population level. And so this is the general structure. We're going to have agents moving in a landscape that has a different structure. We have houses, we have parks, and those structures have different attributes. So we first did a preliminary agent-based model that it's very simple. We just have a park, we have inserted in a urban matrix, and the red squares are yards that may have ticks. So the ticks can be either in the parks or in those yards that have ticks. And agents, people, can be exposed or not exposed to ticks, and they have different type of behaviors. They have a random walk. So in this very early model, we just introduced random walk. They don't have any particular activity patterns, and they use no protective measures. And we tested a few counterfactual scenarios. So we have a not adaptive behavior scenario where people get exposed to ticks and they continue going their daily activities and no changes. And then we explore 3 different behavioral changes, whether it was avoidance behavior, or they used personal protective measures, or they thought that they got the tick in their yard, so they sprayed their yard. So these are kind of some of the results. And basically, what we found is that all the measures, all the adaptive measures, reduce the human tick contact rate, and avoidance behaviors were the ones that reduce it the most. But because we were really interested on how this changed along urbanization gradient and what is the effect of landscape, we decided to basically this project is based particularly on an urban area, so we were mostly interested in this section here, but we know that the host movement, the non-human host movement, and also human movement change depending on the gradient of urbanization and the landscape configuration. And we know that this landscape configuration has great implications on host movement that will definitely affect the tick hazard, and also on how humans move in the environment. So we can think that if it's more pristine and less fragmented, there's less zoonotic hazard and less human exposure risk, and the opposite is if it's more fragmented. So we're interested in the functional connectivity, and if we recover this functional connectivity for humans in particular in this model, based on different landscapes. So we did construct some theoretical landscapes where we have a gradient of forest cover from 10% to 90%, and then a gradient of fragmentation. And so we have 200 landscapes that we run our models on. And just to give you an example, this is how a landscape with 70% coverage and a percolation probability that we use to estimate that fragmentation level. It's 0.45, that means it's pretty aggregated. That's what it looks like, and this is the opposite if we have still an aggregated landscape but at 10% forest cover. And we added a little bit more complexity because we know that in the urban matrix, we added 10% of infected houses and of houses with ticks, and they're not all the same. So we use this concept of ecological neighborhoods where the areas around the parks, or the green spaces in this case, had the highest risk of having ticks being deposited, or like the host going into visiting the yards and transporting the ticks with them. So with this, we run the models, all the simulations across the gradient, and we run this GAN model on the simulations. And what we found is, not surprisingly, a linear relationship between the forest cover percent and the human tick contact rate. And fragmentation had a lower effect, but it was non-linear. And we found highest human tick contact rates at intermediate fragmentations level. But what was interesting is that the model with the interactions actually fitted the data better. And we found that at high forest fragmentation levels, we still recovered that linear relationship between forest cover and human tick contact rate, But if the area was very fragmented, then human tick contact rate it reached a plateau at a certain forest cover percentage. And that means that when you have more pristine areas, people are not really getting exposed into the pristine areas or the interior of the forest. So those are our main results from this model. And just moving forward, we are adding some realism to the model, just because I told you we're basing this and collecting data on an urban area. This is Staten Island in New York City. So the next step will be to add the tick density from this area, but also we're collecting behavioral and movement data so we can better characterize our agents, and we use an app to collect that data. And with that, thank you very much. I'll take any questions you have.
So we have time for one or two quick questions, one longer question or two quicker questions. Do we have any online questions? Yeah.
I'm curious about the last part about the app. Can you explain a little bit more about that and how it works and what you're asking of the people?
The app?
Yeah.
Yeah, so in one of the first questions we had is we wanted to, human behavioral components is very important, as I mentioned. And the first question is how do we measure that? And so we decided to use an app which gets movement data, so GPS data, and it was optimized to not drain people's cell phones. And we also have a daily survey where it's very quick. They only ask a few questions about what, like activity patterns, so what you did that day. So not just the movement, but what they were doing. If they were hiking, if they were working, and if they use any protective measures. So try to get all those behavioral components. And it's open, and you can actually go on like your app store and download it. But we actively recruited people on Staten Island. So we have a little bit more than 100 people that we're analyzing the data. We just don't have it, but we have movement data, but also activity patterns that we're hoping to use that in combination with the data from the tick data from the yards and the parks.
Thank you.